The rooftop terrace of the Ashford Grand Hotel glittered like a crown jewel suspended above the Manhattan skyline. 300 of the most powerful people in America stood beneath strings of golden lights, champagne flutes catching the reflection of a cerulean infinity pool that seemed to pour directly into the sky. It was the kind of evening where fortunes were pledged over canapes and alliances were forged between courses. Nobody expected blood in the water. Zaire Naomi Okonkwo-Kwan stood at the edge of that pool in a floor-length emerald gown, her locks pinned in an elegant updo adorned with thin gold cuffs. She was radiant, composed, and utterly unbothered by the 6'3" white billionaire who had cornered her near the water's edge, his face flushed with bourbon and bitterness. What happened next took exactly 4 seconds. For seconds, that 300 phones captured from 300 angles. For seconds, that would destroy a $12 billion empire. For seconds, that would teach one very powerful, very arrogant man a lesson he should have learned long before he ever laid his hands on a woman whose husband controlled every inch of the ground beneath his feet. Garrison Whitmore Ashford III, hotel magnate, real estate titan, and the man Forbes once called the last untouchable billionaire, placed both palms flat against Zaire's chest and shoved her backward into the rooftop infinity pool. Her body broke the surface like a crack of thunder. The silence that followed was louder. And somewhere in the crowd, a phone was already ringing. On the other end of that call was a man who had not built his empire on handshakes and quarterly reports. A man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and feared in backrooms. A man who had once told Zaire, on the night he married her, that anyone who made her cry would learn the difference between wealth and power. His name was Kwon Seo-jin. And he was already on his way. If you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is about to take turns you will not see coming. 3 days before the gala. The 52nd floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Manhattan belonged to one company and one company alone, Vantablack Industries. The name itself was a statement. Vantablack, the darkest substance known to science, a material that absorbed 99.965% of visible light. Nothing escaped it. Nothing reflected off it. It simply consumed everything that came near it and gave nothing back. It was, by every measure, the perfect name for an empire built by Kwon Seo-jin. At 29 years old, Seo-jin was not what the American business press expected when they heard the words tech CEO. He stood 6'1" with a lean, angular frame, sharp cheekbones that could have been carved from marble, and dark eyes that carried the quiet intensity of a man who had learned very early in life that silence was more dangerous than shouting. His black hair was always immaculately styled, swept back, not a strand out of place, and he dressed in custom suits so dark they seemed to drink the light around him. But it was not his appearance that made boardrooms go quiet when he entered. It was his reputation. Vantablack Industries had started as a small AI analytics firm in Seoul, South Korea, founded by Seo-jin when he was 23. Within 2 years, the company had developed a proprietary artificial intelligence platform called Spectre, Strategic Predictive Engine for Commercial Terrain and Economic Risk. Spectre could analyze thousands of data points across global real estate markets and predict, with 97% accuracy, which commercial properties would fail within 18 months. The technology was, in a word, devastating. Banks wanted it. Hedge funds needed it. Governments feared it. And every major real estate developer in the Western Hemisphere understood that whoever controlled Spectre controlled the future of commercial property. Seo-jin controlled Spectre. But that was only the surface. Beneath the gleaming corporate facade of Vantablack Industries lay something far older, far deeper, and far more intricate. The Kwon family had roots that stretched back 4 generations to Busan, South Korea, where Seo-jin's great-grandfather had built a shipping empire that became the economic backbone of the entire southern coast. Over decades, the family's influence had expanded beyond shipping into finance, construction, and political consulting. They were not politicians themselves, they were the people who decided which politicians survived. In Korea, the Kwon family was known as Jirimja Wangwon, the Shadow Crown. They did not sit on thrones. They built the rooms where thrones were placed, and they decided who sat in them. When Seo-jin moved Vantablack's headquarters to New York 3 years ago, he brought more than a tech company. He brought an infrastructure. A network of loyalties, obligations, and alliances that stretched from Seoul to Shanghai, from Tokyo to Toronto, and now, deep into the concrete veins of Manhattan itself. His family's construction arm held contracts on 14 major buildings in the city. Their financial subsidiary managed pension funds for 3 of the largest municipal unions. Their logistics company handled port operations that accounted for nearly 20% of all container traffic entering the eastern seaboard. Seojin did not merely operate in the city. He owned the architecture of how the city functioned. And he had done all of this while maintaining a public persona so polished, so controlled, and so deliberately understated that most people, including most of the American business elite, saw only what he wanted them to see. A brilliant young tech CEO with an Ivy League education, a quiet demeanor, and a stunningly beautiful wife. They had no idea what lay beneath the surface. Which was, of course, exactly how Seojin preferred it. On this particular Tuesday morning, 3 days before the Ashford Foundation Charity Gala, Seojin sat at the head of a glass conference table reviewing a contract worth $1.3 billion. The contract was a licensing agreement that would grant Ashford Holdings Group exclusive access to Spectre's predictive algorithms for commercial real estate analysis across North America. It was the largest single technology licensing deal in the sector's history, and it had taken 11 months of negotiations to reach this point. Across the table sat Seojin's chief legal counsel and the woman who had personally drafted every clause of the 340-page agreement. Zaire Naomi Okonkwo-Kwan, his wife. Zaire was 28 years old, a graduate of Columbia Law School, and a former federal prosecutor who had spent 3 years in the Southern District of New York before Seojin had convinced her to join Vantablack as general counsel. She was brilliant, not in the way that people use the word casually, but in the way that made opposing attorneys visibly nervous when she entered a courtroom. She could dissect a contract the way a surgeon dissected tissue, with precision, patience, and an almost unsettling calm. She was also, in her own right, formidable. The daughter of a Nigerian-American professor of constitutional law and a Ghanaian-born neurosurgeon, Zaire had been raised in a household where excellence was not aspirational, it was atmospheric. She spoke 4 languages. She had published legal scholarship that was cited in federal appellate decisions. And she carried herself with the kind of quiet, unshakable composure that came from knowing exactly who she was and refusing to apologize for any of it. Her locks fell past her shoulders, and she wore them freely, adorned with thin gold cuffs that caught the light when she moved. Her skin was deep brown, luminous, and she had a way of looking at people, direct, unhurried, with just the slightest tilt of her head that made most people feel as though she could see straight through them. Seojin had fallen in love with her the first time she'd looked at him that way. That had been 4 years ago, at a legal technology conference in Boston. He had been a panelist. She had been in the audience. During the Q&A, she had stood up and, in 90 seconds, dismantled his entire argument about AI regulation with such surgical precision that the moderator had actually laughed out loud. After the panel, Seojin had found her at the reception. He'd walked up to her, handed her his card, and said, in English so precise it barely carried an accent, "I need someone who can think like that working with me, not against me." She'd looked at his card. Then she'd looked at him. "I don't work for people," she'd said. "I work with them. There's a difference." He'd smiled, one of the rare, genuine smiles that very few people ever saw, and said, "Good. I don't need employees. I need equals." They were married 14 months later in a private ceremony on Jeju Island, attended by 40 guests and officiated by a retired Supreme Court justice who happened to be Zaire's godfather. Now, 3 years into their marriage, they sat across from each other in the Vantablack conference room, and Zaire was frowning. "This indemnification clause is insufficient," she said, tapping her pen against page 247 of the contract. Ashford's legal team inserted language that limits their liability for any discriminatory application of the Spectre data. They're trying to shield themselves from civil rights claims. Seojin leaned back in his chair. "What kind of discriminatory application?" "Redlining," Zaire said flatly. "If they use Spectre's predictive data to systematically avoid investing in communities of color, or worse, to identify and accelerate the economic decline of those communities so they can acquire properties at below-market rates. This clause protects them from liability. And it makes Vantablack complicit." Seojin's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A stillness that, to anyone who knew him well, was far more dangerous than anger. "Remove it," he said. "I already drafted replacement language," Zaire replied, sliding a marked-up document across the table. "Anti-discrimination provisions with independent auditing requirements, mandatory diversity impact assessments, and a termination clause that gives us the right to void the entire agreement if any application of Spectre data results in demonstrable harm to marginalized communities." Seojin picked up the document and read it carefully. After a long moment, he looked at his wife. "Ashford won't accept this." "Then Ashford doesn't get the technology. This deal is worth $1.3 billion, Zaire." She met his gaze without blinking. "And our integrity is worth more." A beat of silence passed between them. Then Seojin set the document down and nodded once. "Send it to their legal team. Non-negotiable." Zaire allowed herself the smallest smile. "Already sent it. 2 hours ago." He stared at her. Then he shook his head, a faint curve touching the corner of his mouth. "You are terrifying." "I know," she said. "That's why you married me." Garrison Whitmore Ashford III had been born into the kind of wealth that did not simply open doors, it removed the need for doors entirely. The Ashford family had been building hotels and commercial properties since his grandfather, Garrison Whitmore Ashford I, had purchased his first plot of land in Midtown Manhattan in 1952. By the time Garrison III inherited the company at age 35, Ashford Holdings Group controlled 47 luxury hotels, 19 office towers, and commercial real estate assets valued at over $12 billion. But empires, like bodies, could rot from the inside. And the Ashford empire was rotting. Over the past 5 years, a combination of catastrophic mismanagement, reckless expansion, and a commercial real estate market that was shifting beneath Garrison's feet like tectonic plates had brought Ashford Holdings to the edge of financial annihilation. Vacancy rates across his properties had climbed to 43%. 3 of his flagship hotels had defaulted on their loans. His creditors, led by Prescott National Bank and its president, a calculating man named Aldous Pemberton Crane, were circling like sharks that had tasted blood in the water. Garrison needed a lifeline. Spectre was that lifeline. With access to Vantablack's AI platform, Garrison could identify which of his properties were salvageable, which should be divested, and, most critically, which emerging markets to target for new development. His financial advisors estimated that the Spectre licensing deal could save the company between $2.80 and $4.1 billion over the next decade by eliminating failed investments before they consumed capital. Without Spectre, Ashford Holdings would be bankrupt within 18 months. Garrison knew this. His board knew this. His creditors knew this. And that knowledge, that dependence on a 29-year-old Korean tech CEO and his black wife, was eating Garrison alive. He hated it. He hated it with every fiber of his being. Garrison Ashford was 61 years old, 6'3", with silver hair swept back from a face that had once been handsome and was now hardened by decades of entitlement and excess. He had been raised to believe that men like him, white, wealthy, generationally powerful, were the natural architects of the world's order. He had attended the right schools, joined the right clubs, married the right woman, twice, both times to socialites with pedigrees longer than their personalities, and surrounded himself with the right allies. Those allies formed a constellation of influence that had, for decades, protected Garrison from the consequences of his own behavior. There was Judge Harlan Montgomery Prescott, a federal judge who had been a college roommate of Garrison's father and who had, over the years, ensured that any legal challenges to Ashford Holdings disappeared into procedural quicksand. There was Senator Cordelia Ashworth Vane, a 3-term senator who had received over $7 million in campaign contributions from Ashford-affiliated PACs and who, in return, had blocked regulatory investigations into the company's labor practices. And there was Aldous Pemberton Crane, president of Prescott National Bank and Ashford's primary creditor, who had extended loan terms and restructured debt on multiple occasions, not out of generosity, but because the bank's own exposure to Ashford was so massive that the company's failure would trigger catastrophic losses. These 3 pillars, judicial protection, political cover, and financial forbearance, had allowed Garrison to operate with impunity for decades. They had shielded him from discrimination lawsuits, silenced former employees who alleged hostile working conditions, and buried investigative reports that documented a systematic pattern of racial bias in Ashford's hiring, promotion, and property management practices. But even pillars had load limits, and the weight was increasing. When Garrison received the revised contract from Vantablack's legal team, complete with Zaire's anti-discrimination provisions, independent auditing requirements, and the termination clause, he did not read past the first page before throwing it across his corner office on the 68th floor of the Ashford Tower. "Who does she think she is?" he snarled to his chief operating officer, a nervous man named Dalton Everly Brooke, who stood near the door as if calculating the distance to the nearest exit. "She's their general counsel," Dalton said carefully. "And she's his wife." "I know who she is," Garrison snapped. "I'm asking who she thinks she is, sending me this manifesto about diversity impact assessments and civil rights provisions. This is a technology licensing deal, not a social justice seminar." Dalton cleared his throat. "Sir, our legal team has reviewed the revisions. They're actually quite standard for Tier 1 corporate governance frameworks. Several of our competitors have adopted similar." "I don't care what our competitors have adopted. I am not going to let some woman dictate the terms of my survival." He said some woman the way a person might say some insect, and Dalton, who had worked for Garrison for 11 years and had heard far worse, simply looked at the floor. "The gala is in 3 days," Garrison continued, his voice dropping to a calculated calm that was somehow more unsettling than his anger. "Quan will be there. His wife will be there. I'll handle this personally." "Sir." "Personally, Dalton." Dalton Everly Brooke nodded once, left the office, and immediately texted his personal attorney to inquire about the enforceability of his own employment contract's severance clause. The Ashford Grand Hotel's rooftop terrace had been transformed into what one lifestyle magazine would later describe as a cathedral of excess suspended between earth and heaven. The infinity pool, which occupied the center of the terrace like a liquid sapphire, had been bordered with floating white orchids and illuminated from below with shifting lights that moved through shades of blue and gold. Surrounding the pool were dining areas draped in cream silk, each table set with crystal stemware and centerpieces of cascading white roses. A 17-piece orchestra occupied a raised platform near the eastern railing, their music drifting out over the skyline like silk unfurling in wind. 300 guests had been invited to the Ashford Foundation's annual charity gala, a fundraiser ostensibly dedicated to supporting arts education in underserved communities, though the irony of that mission statement, given Ashford Holdings' documented history of divesting from those very communities, was lost on no one who was paying attention. The guest list read like a directory of American power. Senators, federal judges, Fortune 500 CEOs, hedge fund managers, media moguls, and the kind of socialites whose last names appeared on hospital wings and museum galleries. They moved through the terrace in clusters of influence, their conversations a ballet of ambition and calculation disguised as small talk. Seojin and Zaire arrived at precisely 8:15 p.m. She wore an emerald gown custom, floor-length, with a high neckline and an open back that revealed the sculptural line of her spine. Her locks were pinned in an elaborate updo, each section adorned with thin gold cuffs that caught the light with every movement. She wore minimal jewelry, small diamond studs, her wedding band, and a thin gold chain at her wrist. She was, without question, the most striking person on that rooftop. And she knew it. Not with vanity, but with the same quiet certainty with which she knew the law, knew her worth, knew the precise dimensions of the space she occupied in the world. Zaire Naomi Okonkwo-Kwan did not walk into rooms hoping to be noticed. She walked into rooms fully aware that she would be, and she had long ago stopped caring whether the attention was admiring or hostile. Tonight, she suspected, it would be both. Seojin walked beside her in a midnight black suit that fit him like it had been woven directly onto his body. His hand rested lightly at the small of her back, not possessively, but protectively. A gesture so subtle that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed the way his fingers pressed slightly harder against her skin when certain eyes in the crowd lingered too long. He had not wanted to come tonight. "This is a performance," he'd said that afternoon, standing in their penthouse bedroom while Zaire fastened her earrings. "Ashford isn't hosting a charity gala. He's hosting an audition." He wants to parade us in front of his allies and prove that he can control the terms of this deal. I know, Zaire had replied calmly. Then why are we going? She turned from the mirror and looked at him with that direct, unhurried gaze that still, after 4 years, made his chest tighten. Because I want him to see me, she said. I want him to look at me and understand that I am not someone he can pressure, manipulate, or intimidate. And I want every person on that rooftop to see it too. Seojin had studied her for a long moment. Then he'd crossed the room, cupped her face in both hands, and kissed her forehead. If he so much as raises his voice at you, he said quietly, his lips still against her skin, I will dismantle everything he has. And I will do it slowly. I know, she whispered. But let me handle it first. He'd pulled back and looked into her eyes. Always. Now, standing on the rooftop terrace of the Ashford Grand Hotel, Seojin kept that promise by staying 3 steps behind her, close enough to reach her in 2 strides, far enough to let her command the space on her own terms. For the first hour, the evening proceeded with the choreographed civility that characterized events of this magnitude. Zaire and Seojin circulated through the crowd, exchanging greetings with business contacts, accepting compliments, and deflecting the inevitable questions about the Ashford-Vanna Black deal with practiced diplomatic ambiguity. We're in productive discussions, Seojin said, more than once, with a smile that revealed nothing. The terms are being refined, Zaire added, with a warmth that was, to the trained ear, entirely professional and not even remotely personal. Garrison Ashford, for his part, spent the first hour holding court near the bar with his constellation of protectors. Judge Harlan Montgomery Prescott, silver-haired and imperious, stood to his left. Senator Cordelia Ashworth Vane, immaculately coiffed and politically calculating, stood to his right. Aldous Pemberton Crane, the banker, hovered nearby, his expression betraying the anxiety of a man who knew exactly how much money was at stake. Garrison drank steadily. Bourbon neat in heavy crystal glasses that the bartender refilled without being asked. By 9 o'clock, he had consumed 4 drinks. By 9:35, at 9:47 p.m., he made his move. Zaire was standing near the edge of the infinity pool, engaged in conversation with Dr. Lenora Cashenpark, a renowned bioethicist and one of the few people at the gala whose company Zaire genuinely enjoyed. They were discussing a recent Supreme Court decision on AI liability when a shadow fell across them. Garrison Whitmore Ashford III positioned himself directly in Zaire's line of sight, blocking her view of the skyline. He was holding a fresh bourbon. His smile was the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Mrs. Kwan, he said. Or do you prefer Mrs. Okonkwo? I can never keep track with you modern women and your hyphenated arrangements. Zaire regarded him with calm, measured attention. Mrs. Okonkwo Kwan. But you can call me counselor if the rest is too challenging. Dr. Cashenpark stifled a smile. Garrison's didn't waver. I wanted to talk to you about this contract your office sent over, he said, stepping closer. The bourbon on his breath was sharp. These revisions. These conditions you've added. The anti-discrimination provisions, Zaire clarified. Yes, they're non-negotiable. Everything is negotiable. Not integrity. A muscle twitched in Garrison's jaw. Around them, the ambient noise of the party continued, but several nearby conversations had quieted. People were watching. Phones were being shifted in hands. The instinct for spectacle was a powerful thing, and the assembled crowd could feel it building like static before a storm. Let me be frank with you, Garrison said, lowering his voice to what he believed was a confidential tone but was, in fact, perfectly audible to everyone within 15 feet. Your husband's company needs this deal as much as I do. You think Vanna Black survives without a flagship contract on this scale? You think your little startup. Vanna Black Industries generated $4.2 billion in revenue last fiscal year, Zaire interrupted gently. We have licensing agreements with 17 sovereign governments and strategic partnerships with 4 of the 6 largest financial institutions in the world. We don't need your deal, Mr. Ashford. You need ours. The silence around them expanded like a ripple in water. Garrison's face darkened. The careful veneer of civility cracked, and beneath it was something raw, something old, something that had been cultivated across generations of unchallenged authority. You know, he said, his voice now carrying a sharp, dangerous edge, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've built more in a single quarter than your husband has built in his entire career. And I am not going to stand here and be lectured by. He stopped himself. But the word he swallowed was loud in its absence. Everyone heard it. The ghost of it hung in the air like smoke. Zaire tilted her head slightly. That look. The one that saw through everything. By what, Mr. Ashford? She asked softly. Please. Finish your sentence. He didn't finish it. Instead, he did something worse. Later, when the footage was analyzed frame by frame, and it would be analyzed by lawyers, by journalists, by millions of viewers around the world, the sequence of events would be reconstructed with forensic precision. At 9:52 p.m., Garrison Whitmore Ashford III set his bourbon glass on the edge of the nearest table. At 9:52 and 11 seconds, he stepped forward into Zaire's personal space, close enough that she could see the broken capillaries in his cheeks and the cold fury in his pale blue eyes. At 9:52 and 14 seconds, he placed both palms flat against her chest and pushed. The force was not subtle. It was not an accident. It was not a stumble or a miscalculation of distance. It was a deliberate, vicious, two-handed shove that sent Zaire Naomi Okonkwo stumbling backward, her heels catching on the pool's edge, her arms reaching for balance that wasn't there. She hit the water with a sound that silenced 300 people. The emerald gown billowed around her like a drowned garden. The gold cuffs in her locks glinted beneath the surface. For a moment, one terrible, crystalline moment, she was submerged, and the only sound on that rooftop was the gentle lapping of water against tile and the distant, oblivious music of a 17-piece orchestra. Then she surfaced, and the world changed. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor, drop a like right now and leave a comment telling me what you think should happen to Garrison. Trust me, you're going to want to stay for the rest of this. Zaire broke the surface of the pool with a sharp intake of breath, water streaming from her locks, the emerald fabric of her gown clinging to her body like a second skin. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not flail or sputter or reach desperately for the pool's edge. She stood. The infinity pool was only 4 feet deep at the near end, designed for aesthetic impact, not swimming, and Zaire simply found her footing on the tiled bottom, straightened her spine, pushed her locks back from her face, and stood in the center of that pool like a queen rising from a baptism. The silence on the rooftop was absolute. 300 people stood frozen in various postures of shock, their champagne flutes suspended midway to their lips, their conversations arrested mid-syllable. Every phone in the vicinity was recording. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing in the water and the man standing at the edge. Garrison's expression had undergone a rapid transformation. The fury that had driven the shove was already curdling into something else, not regret, exactly, but the dawning awareness that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the phones. He looked at the faces of his allies, Judge Prescott, Senator Ashworth Vane, Aldous Crane, and saw, in each of them, the unmistakable expression of people who were already calculating their distance from the blast radius. She slipped, Garrison said, and the lie was so transparent, so pathetically inadequate, that it actually made the silence worse. Zaire didn't look at him. She waded to the edge of the pool, and Dr. Lenora Cashenpark was there immediately, extending both hands, helping her climb out. Someone produced a wrap, a cream cashmere shawl that materialized from somewhere, and draped it over Zaire's shoulders. Zaire stood on the pool deck, dripping, composed, incandescent with a dignity that made every silk-draped, diamond-encrusted person on that rooftop feel suddenly, acutely small. She looked at Garrison. "I didn't slip," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried across the terrace like a bell. "And every person here knows it." Then she turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving a trail of water on the marble tiles, leaving 300 witnesses, leaving 100 phones still recording. Leaving Garrison Whitmore Ashford III standing at the edge of his own pool in the ruins of his reputation. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because Kwon Seo-jin was already walking toward Garrison, and the look on his face was something that several attendees would later describe, independently and consistently, as the most frightening thing they had ever seen, not because he was shouting, not because he was violent, not because he was out of control, but precisely because he was none of those things. He was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. Seo-jin stopped 3 feet from Garrison. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked at the older man with those dark, unreadable eyes, and the silence between them was so dense, so charged, that the people nearest to them took involuntary steps backward. When Seojin finally spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying only far enough for Garrison and the nearest witnesses to hear. But in the age of high-quality phone microphones, every syllable was captured. "You put your hands on my wife." It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact delivered with the precision of a surgeon marking the first incision. "Now listen to me," Garrison started, raising a hand. "The deal is dead." Garrison blinked. "What?" "The $1.3 billion licensing agreement. It's dead. As of this moment, Vantablack Industries will not do business with Ashford Holdings Group. Not now. Not ever." The color drained from Garrison's face so completely that, for a moment, he looked like a man who had just been told he was dying. Which, in a financial sense, was exactly what had happened. You can't just." "I can," Seojin said. "I just did." "This is business," Garrison hissed, the desperation cracking through his voice. You can't let personal. Personal." Seojin repeated the word softly as though tasting it. "You just assaulted my wife in front of 300 witnesses. You think this is personal?" He paused. "No, this is about character. And yours just told me everything I need to know about how you would use my technology." He straightened the cuff of his suit jacket, a small, deliberate gesture that somehow conveyed more authority than Garrison's entire fortune. "You have 47 hotels," Seojin continued. 19 office towers. A total debt exposure of approximately $6.8 billion, of which $4.3 billion is held by financial institutions that have active partnerships with Vantablack Industries. Your primary lender is Prescott National Bank, whose pension fund management is contracted through my subsidiary, Meridian Capital Partners. Garrison's mouth opened. No sound came out. Your construction permits in 4 states are processed through municipal offices whose union contracts are administered by organizations with significant ties to my family's logistics operations. Your insurance policies are underwritten by a consortium in which my associates hold controlling interests. Seojin took one step closer. "I don't just have a company, Mr. Ashford. I have infrastructure. I have relationships. I have leverage that your generation didn't even know existed because you were too busy assuming the world would always look the way it looked when your grandfather was building his first hotel." He let that settle. "I didn't come to this city to ask permission. I came to build something that would outlast men like you. And tonight, you've given me every reason to ensure that your name becomes a footnote while mine becomes a foundation." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. The video of what you did tonight will be on every major news platform within the hour. I won't need to send it. Your own guests will do that for me. Because the thing about power, Mr. Ashford, is that real power doesn't need to announce itself." He looked back over his shoulder. "It just acts." And then Kwon Seojin walked away, following the trail of water his wife had left on the marble, and Garrison Whitmore Ashford III stood alone at the edge of a pool that had just become his grave. The video went viral in 17 minutes. Not one video, dozens. From dozens of angles, in varying degrees of resolution, with captions and commentary that ranged from outraged to incandescent. The hashtags materialized almost instantly. Hashtag Ashford push, hashtag Zaire rises, hashtag she didn't slip, hashtag drain the Ashford. By midnight, every major news outlet in the country had the story. By 2 a.m., international media had picked it up. By dawn, the footage had been viewed over 40 million times across platforms, and the number was still climbing. The narrative that emerged was devastating for Garrison, not merely because of what the video showed, but because of what it represented. This was not an isolated incident. This was a symbol. A wealthy, powerful white man physically attacking a black woman at a luxury event because she had dared to assert her professional authority. The imagery was too potent, too historically resonant, too viscerally enraging to be contained by any PR strategy. And Garrison's PR strategy was, in any case, catastrophically inadequate. His initial statement, released at 3 a.m. through his personal spokesperson, read, "There was a misunderstanding at this evening's event. Mr. Ashford looks forward to resolving any concerns privately." A misunderstanding. The internet responded with the kind of collective fury that only the internet could produce. Memes proliferated. Think pieces multiplied. Commentators of every political persuasion found common ground in their condemnation. Former employees of Ashford Holdings began coming forward, first on social media, then through formal channels, with accounts of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation that painted a picture of a corporate culture so toxic that the pool incident began to look not like an aberration, but like a culmination. Dalton Everly Brooke, Garrison's chief operating officer, resigned at 7 a.m. the following morning. His resignation letter, which was leaked to the press within hours, contained a single devastating line: "I can no longer in good conscience serve an organization whose leadership treats human dignity as an inconvenience." The dominoes began falling. Prescott National Bank, through a terse statement from Aldous Pemberton Crane, announced that it was reviewing its financial relationship with Ashford Holdings Group in light of recent developments. The review, as everyone understood, was a prelude to calling in the loans. Senator Cordelia Ashworth Vane, who had spent years providing political cover for Garrison's operations, issued a statement expressing deep concern about the incident and announcing that she would be returning all contributions received from Ashford-affiliated entities. The total amount returned was $7.4 million. Judge Harlan Montgomery Prescott, whose long friendship with the Ashford family had shielded the company from legal accountability for decades, recused himself from 2 pending cases involving Ashford Holdings, citing potential conflicts of interest. It was the judicial equivalent of a ship's captain quietly climbing into a lifeboat. Within the company itself, the collapse accelerated with a speed that caught even seasoned corporate observers off guard. 3 board members resigned within 48 hours. The company's stock, which traded on a private exchange accessible to institutional investors, plummeted by 62%. Insurance providers began reviewing and, in several cases, canceling policies. Construction projects in 4 states were halted when municipal authorities announced they would be conducting enhanced reviews of all Ashford-related permits. And through it all, Kwon Seo-jin said nothing publicly. He didn't need to. The infrastructure he had described on that rooftop, the financial relationships, the municipal contracts, the logistics networks, the insurance consortiums, was doing exactly what infrastructure does. It was functioning. It was applying pressure not through dramatic gestures or public pronouncements, but through the quiet, systematic withdrawal of the support systems that a $12 billion empire required to survive. Seo-jin didn't make phone calls demanding action. He didn't issue threats or ultimatums. He simply allowed things to proceed. A pension fund review here. A contract renegotiation there. A logistics delay that held up construction materials for 3 critical projects. A regulatory inquiry that had been dormant for years suddenly finding new energy and resources. It was not vengeance. It was consequence. And it was devastatingly effective. The courtroom where Garrison Whitmore Ashford III faced assault charges was a federal courtroom in the Southern District of New York, the same district where Zaire Naomi Okonkwo-Kwan had once served as a prosecutor. The irony was not lost on anyone. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: the video evidence, which was incontrovertible, the testimony of 17 eyewitnesses, including Dr. Lenora Cashenpark, who provided a detailed, composed, and utterly damning account of the incident, and a pattern of prior behavior that included sworn depositions from 14 former Ashford Holdings employees who described a culture of intimidation, racial hostility, and retaliatory termination. Garrison's defense attorney, a high-priced litigator named Rothwell Harrington McAllister, attempted to frame the incident as an unfortunate moment of frustration exacerbated by alcohol consumption and business pressure. He argued that Garrison had not intended to push Zaire into the pool, that the contact was minimal, and that the fall was the result of Zaire's proximity to the pool edge rather than the force of the push. This argument might have been more persuasive if Garrison had not, during the trial, referred to Zaire as that woman 11 times, a pattern the prosecution highlighted in closing arguments. Zaire herself testified on the 4th day of the trial. She wore a simple navy suit, her locks pulled back in a low bun, and she spoke with the same calm, precise composure that had characterized every professional moment of her life. When asked by the prosecutor what Garrison had said to her before the assault, she recounted the conversation in detail, including the unfinished sentence, the word he had swallowed. He stopped himself, she said. But the absence of the word was as clear as the word itself. Everyone heard what he didn't say. When Garrison's attorney cross-examined her, he attempted to suggest that Zaire had provoked the confrontation by being combative and dismissive in her tone. Zaire looked at him with that quiet, devastating gaze. "Counselor," she said, "I was standing at a party, speaking with a colleague, when a man twice my age and nearly a foot taller than me put his hands on my body without my consent and pushed me into a body of water. If you're asking me whether I was combative, the answer is no. I was professional. But I understand that for some people, a black woman who refuses to be deferential can look the same as a black woman who is being combative. That perception is not my problem. It's yours." The courtroom was silent for 11 seconds after she finished speaking. The court reporter would later note that it was the longest uninterrupted silence she had ever recorded during a trial. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Garrison was sentenced to 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory anger management and cultural sensitivity training, and a restraining order prohibiting any contact with Zaire or Seogin. He was also ordered to pay restitution of $2.7 million. But the criminal sentence was almost incidental compared to the civil consequences. Zaire's civil attorneys, a team she had personally assembled from 3 of the most formidable litigation firms in the country, filed a civil suit against Garrison and Ashford Holdings Group that alleged assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and, most significantly, a pattern of discriminatory conduct that violated multiple federal civil rights statutes. The civil discovery process unearthed a trove of internal documents that made the pool incident look like the tip of a glacier. Emails between senior Ashford executives using racial slurs. Memoranda directing property managers to implement screening criteria that were, in effect, modern redlining. Performance reviews that systematically penalized employees of color for the same behaviors that were rewarded in white employees. A confidential report, commissioned by Ashford's own Human Resources Department and subsequently buried, that found a pervasive culture of racial animus at every level of the organization. The civil settlement was $47 million. But even that number was dwarfed by the structural collapse that followed. Ashford Holdings Group's board of directors, the remaining members, those who hadn't already resigned, voted unanimously to remove Garrison as CEO and chairman. He was escorted from the Ashford Tower by security on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a single box of personal items, while a crowd of photographers documented every step. 3 weeks later, Ashford Holdings Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing listed total debts of $7.2 billion against assets that had been revalued at just $3.1 billion. A gap that reflected not just the financial damage of the scandal, but the systematic withdrawal of the support infrastructure that had been quietly receding since the night of the gala. Federal investigators, emboldened by the civil discovery documents, opened a formal investigation into civil rights violations at Ashford Holdings. The investigation would ultimately result in consent decrees, structural reforms, and additional financial penalties that would take years to fully resolve. Garrison Whitmore Ashford III, once called the last untouchable billionaire, became the most visible cautionary tale in American corporate history. He was not arrested again. He was not physically harmed. He was not subjected to any of the dramatic, cinematic forms of retribution that might have satisfied a craving for spectacle. He was simply made irrelevant. And for a man who had built his entire identity on the belief that he mattered more than other people, irrelevance was a fate worse than anything a prison cell could have offered. In the weeks following Garrison's removal, a curious thing happened. The story refused to die. Long after the news cycle should have moved on, long after the next scandal should have consumed the public's attention, people kept returning to the image of Zaire Naomi Okonkwo-Kwan standing in that pool. Standing, not drowning, not floundering, not helpless. Standing. Spine straight. Locks streaming water. Eyes clear. The image became iconic. Artists painted it. Photographers recreated it. A muralist in Brooklyn rendered it across the entire side of a 4-story building, depicting Zaire rising from stylized blue water with the words, "She didn't slip," rendered in gold beneath her feet. Zaire, characteristically, said very little about it publicly. She gave one interview to a journalist she knew personally and trusted, in which she addressed the incident and its aftermath with her customary precision. "I wasn't thinking about symbolism when I was standing in that pool," she said. "I was thinking about the fact that my gown was ruined and my locks were going to take 3 hours to dry. But I understand why the image resonated. Because people, especially Black women, are tired of being pushed. Literally and figuratively. And they wanted to see someone stand up. So I stood up. That's all." When asked about Seojeon's response, the speech on the rooftop, the systematic dismantling of Ashford's empire, she paused for a long time before answering. "Seojeon and I are partners," she said. "In every sense of the word. He didn't do what he did because I'm fragile and needed protecting. He did it because he understands that when someone attacks the people you love, your response reveals who you are. And who Seojeon is someone who keeps his promises." "What promise?" the journalist asked. Zaire smiled. It was the first time, in any public context, that anyone had seen her smile since the incident. "He promised me that anyone who made me cry would learn the difference between wealth and power." "Did you cry?" "Not in front of Garrison. But later." Another long pause. "Later, at home, when it was just us, yes. I cried. Not because I was hurt or humiliated. I cried because I was angry. Because in that moment, standing in that pool, I was reminded that no matter how many degrees I earn, no matter how many cases I win, no matter how much I achieve, there will always be people who see me and see only something to be pushed aside. And that makes me angry. And the anger made me cry." She straightened in her chair. "But the tears didn't last long. Because anger, for me, has always been fuel. And I have a lot of work to do." 2 years later. The Meridian Tower still rose from the Manhattan skyline like a dark blade, but the company it housed had transformed. Vantablack Industries, under Seojeon's leadership and with Zaire as both general counsel and newly appointed chief ethics officer, had expanded its operations to 12 cities across 4 countries. The Spectre platform had been licensed to 23 governments and 41 financial institutions, with every contract containing the anti-discrimination provisions that Zaire had originally drafted for the Ashford deal. Those provisions, now known informally in the industry as the Algonquin standards, had become the benchmark for ethical AI deployment in commercial real estate. 3 international regulatory bodies had adopted them as model frameworks. 2 Harvard Business School case studies had been written about them. And Zaire herself had been invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee on AI ethics, where she had delivered testimony so comprehensive and so compelling that the subcommittee chair, a senator who had, in a former life, received campaign contributions from Ashford-affiliated PACs, had publicly called it the most important testimony this committee has heard in a decade. Seojeon, for his part, had continued to operate with the deliberate quietness that had always characterized his approach to power. He gave few interviews. He made few public appearances. He let the work speak for itself. But those who paid attention, those who tracked the movement of capital, the shifting of alliances, the quiet restructuring of power in America's largest cities, understood that Kwon Seojeon had not merely survived the Ashford affair. He had used it as a fulcrum. The publicity, the public sympathy, the demonstrated willingness to sacrifice a $1.3 billion deal on principle, all of it had reinforced his reputation as a man whose word was absolute and whose values were non-negotiable. In a world where most billionaires were seen as interchangeable avatars of self-interest, Seojeon had become something rare, a man of power whom people trusted. Not because he was gentle, he wasn't, but because he was consistent. His promises were kept. His threats were fulfilled. His principles were applied evenly, without exception, without sentiment. The Shadow Crown had found new soil, and it was flourishing. Zaire had taken a portion of the civil settlement, $12 million, and established the Algonquin Justice Fund, a non-profit organization that provided legal representation, career support, and mental health resources to victims of workplace discrimination and racial harassment. Within its first year, the fund had assisted over 400 individuals, filed 67 complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and achieved settlements totaling over $89 million on behalf of its clients. She had also, quietly and without publicity, reached out to 14 former Ashford Holdings employees who had testified during the civil trial. The brave individuals who had come forward with accounts of discrimination and retaliation at enormous personal risk. The fund provided each of them with career counseling, legal protection, and, in several cases, direct financial support during the period of professional transition that followed their testimony. They put themselves on the line, Zaire told her small team at the fund's headquarters in Harlem. They told the truth when telling the truth could have cost them everything. We don't forget that. We don't ever forget that. The team didn't forget. And neither did the public. On a cool Saturday morning in October, 2 years and 3 months after the incident, a small ceremony was held on the rooftop terrace of what had once been the Ashford Grand Hotel. The hotel had been acquired out of bankruptcy by a consortium led by Meridian Hospitality Group, a Vantablack subsidiary, and had been renamed the Meridian Grand. The renovation had been extensive, thoughtful, and deliberate, preserving the building's architectural beauty while stripping away every trace of the Ashford brand. The rooftop terrace, however, had undergone only one change. The infinity pool remained. The orchids remained. The view of the Manhattan skyline remained. But at the pool's edge, set into the marble tile at the exact spot where Garrison Whitmore Ashford III had placed his hands on Zaire's chest and pushed, there was now a brass plaque. It read, "In honor of all who have been pushed and who chose to stand. Dignity does not need permission to belong." The name was a quiet tribute. Carter had been Zaire's maternal grandmother's maiden name, Amara Noel Carter, a woman who had marched with civil rights workers in Selma at the age of 17 and who had spent 60 years as a schoolteacher in rural Georgia, teaching children who looked like her that they deserved to take up space in the world. Zaire had chosen the name without consulting Siajin, and when she'd told him, he had simply nodded and said, "It's perfect." At the ceremony, which was attended by fewer than 50 people, mostly fund recipients, former Ashford employees, and close friends, Zaire stood at the pool's edge in a cream-colored dress, her locks free and adorned with the same thin gold cuffs she had worn on the night of the gala. She looked at the water. Then she looked at the people gathered around her. 2 years ago, she said, I stood in this pool, soaking wet, in a ruined dress, in front of 300 people who had just watched a man decide that I didn't belong here. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt exactly what he wanted me to feel. Small. Invisible. Wrong. She paused. But then I remembered something my grandmother told me when I was a girl. She said, "Baby, the people who try to push you down are always standing on ground they didn't build. And the ground knows it. The ground always knows." She touched the brass plaque with the tips of her fingers. Garrison Ashford didn't fall because my husband is powerful. He didn't fall because the video went viral. He didn't fall because the courts punished him. He fell because the ground beneath him, the relationships, the institutions, the people he had taken for granted and mistreated for decades, finally decided to stop holding him up. She looked at Siojin, who stood at the edge of the crowd with his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression that, for once, was not carefully controlled. There was something open in his face, something luminous. Pride, yes, but also something deeper. The look of a man who understood, fully and without reservation, that the woman he loved was exactly who she had always been, and that no one, not Garrison Ashford, not the world's cruelty, not the weight of history, had been able to change that. Zaire smiled at him. Then she turned back to the crowd. This pool is not a monument to what happened to me. It's a reminder of what I chose to do afterward. I chose to stand up. I chose to fight back, not with fists, but with law. Not with anger, but with purpose. And I chose to build something that would outlast the pain. She straightened her spine, that same motion, that same posture that had made an image of her rising from the water into something iconic. Dignity does not need permission to belong, she said. And neither do we. The applause was not thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was steady, warm, and real, the sound of people who understood what they were witnessing and who knew that they would carry it with them. Later that evening, after the ceremony, after the guests had departed, After the rooftop terrace had emptied and the city lights had taken over the sky, Zaire and Seojin stood alone at the edge of the reflection pool. The water was still. The brass plaque gleamed faintly in the ambient light. Seojin stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting against the top of her head. They were silent for a long time. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm okay," she said. "You were extraordinary today. I was honest today. There's a difference." He smiled against her hair. "There's really not. Not with you." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. Her eyes were clear, her expression open, her composure for this moment, in this private space, softened into something more tender, more vulnerable, more true. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For keeping your promise." He looked at her. "Which one?" "All of them." He cupped her face in both hands, the same gesture from their penthouse, from before the gala, from the night when everything had changed. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "I have one more promise," he said. "What?" "That I will never stop building a world where no one can push you again. And if they try." "I know," she whispered, smiling. "You'll dismantle them." Slowly. Very slowly, he confirmed. She laughed, a real laugh, warm and full and unguarded, and the sound of it drifted across the empty rooftop, over the still water of the reflection pool, and out into the vast, glittering expanse of a city that, more than either of them would ever publicly admit, belonged to them. Not because they owned it, but because they had earned the right to shape it. 6 months after the reflection pool ceremony, Garrison Whitmore Ashford III was spotted at a coffee shop in Greenwich, Connecticut, living in a rented 3-bedroom house. A substantial step down from the penthouse suite he had once occupied at the Ashford Grand. He was 63 years old, visibly diminished and entirely alone. His second wife had filed for divorce during the bankruptcy proceedings. His adult children from his first marriage had publicly distanced themselves. His allies, the judge, the senator, the banker, had not returned his calls in over a year. He was not destitute. The personal assets he had shielded through various trusts and legal entities allowed him a comfortable, if dramatically reduced, existence. He would live out his years in the particular kind of purgatory reserved for powerful men who had been stripped of everything except the memory of what they once were. He was, as Seojin had predicted, a footnote. Meanwhile, the story continued to write itself. The Okonkwo Justice Fund expanded to 5 cities. Vantablack Industries was valued at $21 billion. Spectre's predictive accuracy climbed to 98.3%. 12 cities now hosted Vantablack offices, each one operating under ethical frameworks that had become industry standard. And on the rooftop of the Meridian Grand Hotel, the reflection pool continued to shimmer beneath the stars, its brass plaque catching the light of every sunrise and reflecting it back into the sky. Dignity does not need permission to belong. A camera can expose what money hides. A single choice can reveal a lifetime of character. And sometimes, the person who gets pushed into the water is the one who changes the tide. And that is where our story ends for now. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because stories like this, they don't stop. They evolve. And the next chapter might be even more powerful than this one. Drop a comment and let me know what part of this story hit you the hardest. I'll see you in the next one.